In the early 19th century, we start to see a little bit of a differentiation in lifestyles in both the North and the South. So it breaks down to a manufacturing lifestyle and economy in the North and an agricultural economy in the South. Starting off, we have advances in agriculture in the Southern economy. We start to see inventions from people like John Deere, Cyrus McCormick, and others who are coming up with things that are going to make work in the South and farming and harvesting nature's resources a lot easier and a lot faster. So John Deere comes up with the lightweight plow, which allows the soil to be prepared and tilled so it could be so crops could be planted, seeds could be planted, and you could harvest those materials. Cyrus McCormick comes up with the idea to put reapers, or in other words, cutting machines behind horses and have horses pull this reaping machine that would cut the wheat and the grains and would do the work that 5 men could do ordinarily in a much shorter time. So now you are quintupling the amount of work that could be done. So in other words, you can get it done 5 times faster. And it forced many farm workers to start farms of their own or begin work in factories. Now, other things that came about were Samuel Morse's telegraph, which was really like the primitive or early form of a text messaging machine. And this helps the economy because people could communicate about prices, about supply, about demand, and that could then make more efficient orders. So farmers or even manufacturers in the North could communicate about what was needed, what they had, and what the prices were. And so that certainly helped out business and helped out the economy. So farmers could get quick information about outside goods. Another advancement in agriculture, which was good for farmers, but it really was a negative thing in the process of trying to end slavery, was the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney in the end of the 18th century. So this was a machine that helped clean and prepare cotton, whereas originally slaves would have to pick it by hand and then separate the good fluffy cotton from the thorns and the rough stems of those cotton plants. Now you could simply just put it in this machine and it gets pulled and raked through these combs, which would, again, pull and separate out the good stuff that you needed, the cotton, and separated the seeds and the thorns and all the things that you didn't want in your clothing. So again, here are some of the images. This is our cotton gin on the right-hand side here, the telegraph on the bottom left, and then McCormick's horse-drawn reaper, which again is kind of like a cutting machine that cuts down the crops so that way they could be processed. Now, all these inventions helped increase agricultural productivity. In other words, farmers got more work done a lot faster. And what that does is it lowers the price of goods. So a typical rule of thumb in economics is anytime something is easier to do or it can be done faster, that's going to lower the prices because it drives up the quantity. So when quantity goes up or when supply goes up, price goes down. So farmers now could sell more crops and could meet the demands that were set. And that meant, again, lower prices so people could buy more. So it's win-win. Win for the customer because now they are having to pay lower prices for the goods that they want or need. And it's win certainly for the farmers because they can afford to lower their prices and bring in more volume, or in other words, they can attract more customers. And we start to see a big demand for cotton from the South. So textile factories in the North where they're making clothing, they have a higher demand for cotton, which means that there's going to be a greater need for slave labor to help pick and harvest and process this cotton to then sell to the North. So again, speaking of the North, we just talked about the Southern agricultural or farming economy or community. So in the North, we start to see more of a textile industry, and this is really a copy of the British textile economy over in England. So with the Industrial Revolution, we start to see the use of factories and machines to do work a lot faster, and this is primarily done in the North. So very few factories, very little manufacturing done in the South. It was mostly a Northern thing. So when we're looking at differences between the North and the South, remember that the North has a manufacturing and textile industry where they're selling clothes and cloth. And then in the South, it's mostly an agricultural economy driven by cotton. So in the North, we also start to see newer inventions like the spinning jenny, which is a machine that helped weave the cotton and the fabrics into something that was wearable as clothing or as blankets or as other form of cloth, towels, things like that. So a couple of reasons why there were fewer factories in the South. One, climate was better for farming. You could farm for almost the entire year, basically anywhere from 10 to 12 months out of the year, whereas in the North, the climate just wasn't suitable for farming because of the colder winters, which then would cause frost and the crops to freeze and a semi-frozen ground, which nothing's going to grow out of the frozen ground, right? And the other reason why there were fewer factories in the South is that slaves could not afford to buy many products. So there wasn't really a demand for people to make things in the South. It was pretty much done in-house. And because a large population of the South was made up of slaves, just about 40% of the Southern population were slaves who not only were typically not making any money, but any money that they had, they sometimes weren't allowed to buy some of these products that maybe Northerners would. So the South began to rely on these Northern industrial products. So we start to see a demand from the North of the cotton in the South, and there was certainly the supply to meet that demand. And in turn, the Southern citizens would purchase some of these manufactured textiles from the North to which they were supplying their cotton for. So speaking of the economy in the North and the workforce in the North, we start to see some disputes with working and some unfair and unsafe practices. So really this is more later in the 19th century, but we start to see the rise of unions and labor forces. So what a union is a group that works to try and make things better for an underrepresented group. And in 21st century America now, we have quite a few unions and labor forces all throughout the country, but primarily in the North. So when there's hazards in the workplace and poor treatment of workers, that caused the need for these unions or these representative groups to form. So these unions were working to try and bring workers shorter work days, because in some places you were expected to work as long as 16-hour days without really any sort of extra compensation. They were still paid their normal rate, and it wasn't just the long work hours. Some of these jobs required some dangerous work, and so many workers felt that they weren't being paid fairly for the dangerous and long hours of work that they were doing. So these unions were trying to get them better pay, better working conditions, or in other words, safer working conditions, cleaner working conditions, and also reasonable work days. Or if you were asked to work a longer period of time, you would get compensated for it. So today, the average work week is 40 hours. Anything over 40 hours a week, your employer is expected to pay you overtime, or in other words, whatever you make for a normal hour's work plus half of that. So they call that time and a half. Many workers got in trouble both legally and professionally when they started to strike, as encouraged by these unions and labor forces, and there got to be some tension between the employers and the employees, or in other words, the bosses and the workers. And many of these strikes and these labor unions were affecting factories in the North more so than the South. So when we talk about labor unions, it was more a Northern thing, because if you think about it, was there any group that was trying to protect or help bring better working conditions for slaves in the South? No, because most Southerners owned slaves, and so they certainly didn't want to put their finances in jeopardy, and they didn't want to have to limit what they could get done with their slave labor. And it's also important to remind everybody that not all slaves were treated unfairly by their slave owners or their masters. In some cases, they were treated like friends, or they were treated like friends of the family. They could eat meals with their slave owners. They could go to parties with their slave owners. They could attend church with their slave owners. But by and large, the relationship between slave owner and slave was pretty much a big disconnect, to where they wouldn't know their names. Sometimes they wouldn't even associate with them. They would have their overseers, or they would have hired hands to deal directly with the slaves, taking orders from the plantation owners. So here we see a picture of women working in the textile factories or textile industry, taking the cotton that you see on the ground there and kind of working it, looming it together to put together and make clothing and cloth fabric.